Hello everyone. Today I will say something about the concept of normalcy, psychological normalcy in the context of structure, hierarchy, authority, in other words, in the context of patriarchy. I will discuss the extent to which our conventional concept of normalcy is fundamentally patriarchal, and I will also make some comments on why it must be so, and why without a patriarchal structure, the very meaning and the very applicability of the idea of normalcy dissipates and the society enters all kinds of problems. At an appropriate standard of psychological normalcy has always been inextricably linked with the possession and endorsement of normative structure. This means that in order to be normal, one had to conform to certain norms and rules, and these norms and rules were typically those erected by the society in order to discriminate between what is socially tolerable and what is socially intolerable. This fence between the normal and the abnormal was fundamentally moral. It was sort of a delineation of what is good socialization and what is bad socialization. So extremely bad socialization would place someone in the realm of abnormality. This is a fundamentally Lacanian idea associated with French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, namely the idea that normalcy is closely associated with successful socialization. And this means that psychological integrity rests on values and the personality traits, most of which tend to be developed by education and socialization, that allow the person to make those values the actual normative foundation of their lives. One of the main threats to this type of normalcy is a change in education and socialization that is associated with the extreme radical political left, specifically the changes dictated by the so-called woke ideology in our time. The radical left is extremely psychologically toxic and socially dangerous, and that in that the pressure that it exerts on education threatens the fundamental facets of psychological normalcy, such as maturity, resilience, and a stable sense of identity. And all of these aspects of normalcy then naturally arise from a perception of stable and normatively permitted relationship with one's fellows. This perception is normally instilled through the early education process. Thus, the need to maintain the organicism and value integrity of education. Organicism is the type of relationship with those who socialize us, who we look up to, the relationship that is not mediated by anything else, not mediated by other structures. The immediate relationship, the organic, sort of direct human-to-human respect that we show to those who we believe embody the values that we should strive for. And this organicism in the mutual respect and in socialization and in human relationships in general ought to characterize education. The value integrity of education is a fundamental therapeutic necessity with a view of preserving the mental health and the mental well-being of the society, and the education as a sort of a vaccine against mental unwellness at least on a mass level, depends on the preservation of these organic structures which are fundamentally patriarchal and fundamentally Lacanian. The structures of authority, respect, normativity, structure. Now, how do we proceed with arguing that structure is the foundation of normalcy? According to Donald Winnicott, one of the key contemporary figures in British psychoanalysis, our relationship to the world forces us to put up false selves, what Winnicott called false selves, that we present to others and sometimes to ourselves. And our false selves are nice, socially acceptable, collaborative, and empathetic. But they are not our authentic selves. According to Winnicott, the authentic self is similar to what Carl Jung called the shadow. The authentic selves are less likable, sometimes delinquent, perverse, or violent selves that we hide from the world. What better place to hide an ugly psychological face than in the unconscious, or as I like to call it, subconscious, for we are not entirely unconscious of what is commonly referred to as unconscious. Rather, it is a basement of our psychological house, a current of thoughts and feelings running just under our feet, a repository of our forbidden memories, desires, and identities that we can sometimes almost feel and touch in our dreams and daydreaming states. It is a subcurrent of our daily perceived reality, a subconscious realm where, according to Winnicott, the authentic self resides. According to Winnicott, somewhere between the false self that we present to the world and the authentic self that we feel when it is dark and we are accountable to no one, we seek a self, something we can fixate as our identity. The activity by which we negotiate this road to a self is play. Winnicott's view is that play is a sui generis adult activity. Children grow up by learning to play. Only adults actually play. Thus, most of our life is a play in search of a self. And this play progresses by the use of different tools. And this is how we learn to be normal or to play a normal societal and personal game. Now, this play, which is intersubjective and thus involves other people, defines who we are. It defines our health, our pathology, our sociability, or our psychopathy. Our play is our social life. The way we play this game, in fact, qualifies us in all kinds of social ways, including our mental health status. One of the key ideas that Winnicott advanced was that discovering one's true or authentic self was a part of the task of psychoanalysis. Thus, the false self, the one that is socially acceptable, is associated with a repression or demotion of authentic desires and identities into the subconscious. The goal of psychoanalysis is to throw light on the magnets that move the figures in our conscious life, where the magnets lie beneath, in the subconscious realm. In other words, according to Winnicott, a quest for the true self, or at least moving as close to it as possible, is the aim of psychotherapy as at least a part of the paradigm of mental health. There is something dark, irrational, and shadowy in this goal, where a deep archaeology of the unconscious is the method of attaining mental health. In a sense, we need to dive into this dark ocean of the unconscious or subconscious to attain our mental health. Contrary to this paradigm, which is essentially Freudian, Lacanian psychoanalysis assumes not only that an in-depth excavation of the unconscious is not necessary, for the unconscious is already there, scattered in the language, as Lacan says. It also takes normalcy. Lacanian psychoanalysis also takes normalcy to be largely identical to successful socialization. What is healthy and normal is not the dark content repressed from daylight because it is too scary to look at, but rather the bright, constructive, good relations with other persons accompanied by a stable and productive social identity. In Lacan's psychoanalysis, the very bearer and beacon of normalcy is the primary carrier of symbolic meanings, the so-called primary signifier, which Lacan calls name of the father. So the patriarchal signifier, which summarizes the socializing and legislating influences a father has on the child and its development. In practice, sometimes the role of name of the father may be performed by someone else in situations where the actual father is absent, for example, dead, or has abandoned the family or inadequate in his fatherly role. However, in the civil society of Lacan's time, it was the father who played the primary normative role for the child, and thus the father was traditionally the focal orientation for individuals in their quest for their social identity. In other words, for Lacan and the Lacanian psychoanalysis as a tradition, name of the father and the actual role of the father in a family are both the same fundamentally educational role in the child's psychological formation and upbringing. It is the moral education that the father brings to the child, and by extension to the family as a whole, that makes the child and the family normal. It is a key facet of normativity of socialization and of the family as a fundamental dynamic influence on the constitution of mental health. Thus, destroying the patriarchal structure of competence and hierarchy in society means fundamentally destroying the very possibility of mental health in that society. According to the Lacanians, there are three registers within which our mind operates. The first is the real, with a capital R, or the unprocessed experience of the world as one encounters it. According to Lacan, the real is by definition unbearable and leads to personality disorganization, to the personal difficulties, to personal disarray, if it's not filtered through the realm of the symbolic with a capital S, where the person is able to interpret the raw experience and give meaning to the real. In situations where the onslaught of the real is beyond one's symbolic capacities, one resorts to the realm of the imaginary with a capital I, which includes psychosis. In other words, one takes refuge from an unlivable reality of the present in an imaginary world which serves as a substitute for the experience of the real. Consequently, for Lacan and the Lacanians, normalcy does not live in the real. It resides in the symbolic. And logically, the more tools and symbolic resources one might have at one's disposal to deal with the unbearable real, the more resilient one is likely to be to psychosis, or to having to defect to the imaginary to escape from the real. When one can't deal with the real, when one does not have sufficient symbolic capacities, one designs a reality of one's own and defects to the imaginary, where they construct their own imaginary reality, which will replace the unbearable reality of the hard, everyday, raw experience. And education is the primary process whereby the person acquires the resources for interpretation and the conferment of meaning. And thus, in the Lacanian perspective, education is a primary vehicle of mental health. The more and better one is educated, save all other factors that might have an impact, the more symbolic resources one will have to fend off a potential onset of psychosis due to an inability to process the unbearable real. Now, I will stop here at this first clip in order to reflect a little bit about the relationship between the structure of education and its therapeutic role as enhancing the mental well-being of those who are being educated, and patriarchy. In fact, it seems to me that Lacan's idea that patriarchy is the same as structure, that is the same as successful socialization and as good education, is a fundamental truth about the conditions that we need to meet in order to have to effect an improvement in the public status of mental health. The situation that we are currently facing, where education is a victim of woke ideology and radical feminism and all kinds of anti-patriarchal ideologies, is the reason for the crumbling of collective mental health. Not because feminism or the woke ideology are malignant ideologies that focus on destroying the collective mental health, but because they are essentially a rebellion against structure, against the structure of reality that is based on a hierarchy of authority and competence and organic relationships based on mutual respect. And the destruction of respect and the destruction of organicism is at the same time the destruction of mental health.